Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
They always say that the oldest daughter is the one who holds the family together. She keeps the holidays running, makes the birthday calls, remembers to send flowers for anniversaries she's not even part of, and learns to swallow the bitter stuff so her siblings don't have to taste it. I never signed up for that role, but somewhere between my dad's silence and my mom's passive-aggressive smiles, I slipped into it and stayed. I kept the peace year after year, even when it meant standing behind someone who couldn't tell the truth if it was tattooed on his forehead. That someone, of course, is my little brother Jake. Jake, the golden boy. Jake, who flunked out of college, but still got clapped on the back by dad like he'd won a Nobel. Jake, who crashed mom's car when he was 22, and somehow I was the one who got the "I thought you were watching him" lecture. For as long as I can remember, Jake was the sun my mother orbited around, and the rest of us just adjusted our lives to avoid the burn. I stopped expecting fairness a long time ago. But even knowing all that, I still wasn't ready for the call I got the morning before his engagement party. I was sitting in my office, my brand new corner office, by the way, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that made you feel like a goddamn executive, because I was one now. After 17 years of corporate crawling, skipped vacations, and pretending to laugh at boardroom jokes that made me want to gouge my eyes out, I had finally landed the promotion. Global VP. The kind of job where they give you a personal assistant and a black Amex and say things like, strategic vision, while handing you bonuses that could buy a house. It was the moment I had worked toward longer than Jake had stayed employed at any job he ever had. My phone rang, and before I even picked up, I had a feeling it was my mom. She has this timing. She always calls right when I'm about to feel good about something. And sure enough, there she was on the screen, MOM. I answered with that guarded tone I always used with her, the one that said, "I'm available but not entirely open." She didn't even say hello. "I just wanted to ask one thing," she started, her voice already coated in that sugar syrup guilt she uses when she's about to ask something wildly unreasonable. "Could you maybe not mention the promotion tomorrow?" I didn't say anything at first. I just let the words hang there like smoke. She filled the silence quickly, as always. "It's just, this weekend is really important for Jake and Danielle. It's their time, you know? I wouldn't want anything to distract from their celebration." Distract. That's the word she used. Like my 17 years of hard work, my exhaustion, the sacrifices I made, were a stray balloon floating into someone else's spotlight. I tried to laugh. It came out flat. "So," I said slowly, "you're asking me not to mention the biggest career moment of my life at a party where people are literally going to stand up and toast a man who once got arrested for peeing on a gas station?" That was years ago, she snapped, faster than I expected. Then softened. "Emily, honey, this isn't about the past. This is about keeping things happy, peaceful. Jake's really trying. Danielle's a good influence. Let's not stir anything up. Let's not stir anything up." That was her mantra. She said it when Dad found texts on Jake's phone from a girl who wasn't his girlfriend back in college. She said it when he blew through his trust fund in under 2 years. She said it when he showed up drunk at my birthday dinner and told me I looked like a secretary pretending to be a boss. And I let it slide. Every single time. For the sake of peace. So I nodded. Not that she could see me, but I knew she'd feel it through the phone somehow. I nodded and I said, "Okay." But here's the truth, I wasn't okay. I didn't feel proud anymore. I felt erased. I felt like I was 12 again, sitting at the kitchen table with straight A's while Mom bragged about Jake's natural charisma after he got a C- and a detention. I was supposed to sit there and clap, always clap, never speak too loud or take up too much space. Still, I went to the party. I wore the dress my assistant picked out. I brought a bottle of wine that cost more than Jake's monthly car payment. I smiled through the fake hugs and the "Emily, you look so successful" comments from relatives who had no idea what I actually did. And I watched him, my brother, in his element, center of attention as usual, making jokes, clinking glasses, smiling like he had the world by the tail. I had almost made it through the night without saying a word about my job. Almost. I was keeping the peace like a pro. And then it happened. It was right after the dessert table opened. Danielle, his fiancée, stood up next to him. She raised her glass and smiled, the kind of smile that looks pretty from far away but twitches a little too much up close. She looked around the room, at the dozens of faces waiting to adore them, waiting to toast the perfect couple. Then she took a deep breath. Not a nervous breath. A breath like she was about to jump off a cliff. And she said, "Before we celebrate, there's something you should know about the man you're toasting tonight." I froze. The entire room went silent. No forks clinked. No glasses touched. You could have heard a pin drop on the damn hardwood. And in that breathless second, I looked at her and thought, she knows something. She knows something big. And more than that, she's not going to keep it quiet. Not like I did. Not like I always did. And in that second, I knew this party wasn't going to end the way my mother planned. Not by a long shot. When I think back to that exact moment, Danielle standing there, tall and deliberate, her champagne glass raised just above her shoulder like she was about to deliver a wedding vow instead of drop a live grenade, I remember not the words she said first, but the feeling that surged through the room before a single syllable left her mouth. It was as if the air changed density, as if everyone in that room suddenly felt that something unplanned, something dangerous and irreversible, was about to unfold right in front of the party lights and homemade bunting, right next to the dessert table and the half-empty punch bowl. That feeling, the one where time slows down just enough for your mind to whisper, "This is the moment it all changes," took hold of me like a vice. I sat up straighter in my seat, as did nearly everyone else. I could see my mother stiffen across the room, her smile freezing in place like a mask made of porcelain just before it cracks. Danielle didn't shake or stammer or even look away from the crowd that had begun to gather their attention, some still holding forks midair, others now setting down their plates, their eyes narrowing with anticipation and, perhaps, a small measure of dread. She didn't look at Jake, though I saw his hand twitch, the one not holding his glass, like he might be weighing whether to grab her wrist or make a joke or quietly vanish through the sliding glass door before the words came. But Danielle didn't flinch. She simply began. "I know this isn't how these things are supposed to go," she said, her voice smooth but not soft, firm but not angry, with a kind of cold clarity that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. "But before we raise our glasses and pretend like everything in our lives is exactly as we want it to be, I think it's fair that we take just a second to be honest, at least once, at least tonight." You could feel the discomfort spreading through the room like a stain on white linen, slow at first, and then obvious, impossible to ignore. A few people exchanged glances. My cousin Alyssa awkwardly cleared her throat. The neighbor from 2 doors down took a step back, clearly calculating how to make a discreet exit in case things escalated. But Danielle wasn't waiting for approval. She turned, slowly now, and for the first time, looked at Jake. "There's someone here who should have been part of this party," she said. "Her name is Lori." The name landed like a dropped plate on tile. Not everyone knew who Lori was, but the few who did, and I was one of them, tensed visibly, their bodies reacting before their brains caught up. My mother blinked hard. My father looked down into his drink like maybe he could fall into it and disappear. Jake opened his mouth, then closed it again, the kind of instinctive gesture you make when you realize you have absolutely no idea what to say that won't make everything worse. Danielle continued, and her voice didn't falter. "Lori was Jake's coworker. She's funny, smart, incredibly kind. And he told her all the same things he told me. About wanting something real. About not being like the guys who cheat. About needing someone who saw him for who he really was. He said all of that to her while we were engaged. While we were picking out napkin colors and writing our vows." A gasp came from somewhere near the fireplace, someone's elderly aunt maybe, but Danielle ignored it. She looked back to the crowd, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be intentional. "I'm not saying this because I want to ruin a party," she said. "I'm saying it because I refuse to spend the rest of my life pretending I didn't see the truth when it stared me in the face." Jake finally found his voice, though it was rough and unsteady, and laced with a desperate smile that had served him well in younger years, but suddenly felt completely out of place. "Babe, come on, this isn't the time or the place. We can talk about this. You're blowing this way out of proportion. Danielle turned to him so slowly it made people uncomfortable, as if she were handling something venomous and wanted to be absolutely sure she didn't get bit in the process. I saw the messages. I saw the pictures. I know the hotel receipts. I talked to Lori. And that's when the room really turned. That's when the whispers started. That's when people began backing away, as if standing too close to Jake might make them guilty by association. That golden glow he carried like a birthright, the easy charm, the half-grin that smoothed over bad behavior, it began to evaporate in real time. My mother stood abruptly, her hand clenched around a linen napkin like she was about to deliver some formal objection. Danielle, I think maybe this conversation would be better handled privately. Danielle didn't even look at her. Of course you do, she said. Then, as if remembering the presence of her glass, she raised it slightly again. So here's to honesty. The kind that ruins the party, but maybe, just maybe, saves the rest of your life. She drank slowly and fully. Then she set the glass down gently on the edge of the table and walked away from Jake without a single glance back. No dramatics. No tears. Just the quiet dignity of someone who finally chose herself. And me? I was still sitting there, heart racing, watching the implosion unfold, when I realized something unsettling but deeply, deeply satisfying. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even particularly surprised. Because deep down, I had always known that Jake was a fraud. A charming fraud, yes, but a fraud nonetheless. And watching the mask come off so publicly, so brilliantly, stirred something in me that had been asleep for years. I stood up slowly, smoothed the front of my dress, and stepped forward. Not because I had planned to speak. Not because I had a speech in my pocket. But because suddenly, the moment felt right. The stage was cracked wide open, and for once in my life, there was space for me to speak. I raised my glass, ignoring my mother's panicked eyes and Jake's shell-shocked expression. I cleared my throat, and with the entire room watching, I said, since we're sharing truths tonight. I got promoted last week. Global VP. I wasn't going to mention it because I was asked not to outshine anyone. But I guess we're done dimming ourselves now, aren't we? I drank. And for the first time in a long time, it tasted like freedom. There's a particular kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful or serene, but rather thick, heavy, and almost menacing, the kind of silence that weighs down on your chest and makes you acutely aware of every breath you take, every creak of a wooden floorboard, every clink of a fork hastily dropped onto a plate by someone who no longer has the appetite for celebration. That's what the room felt like in the seconds after I finished my toast, and in those moments where all eyes flicked between Danielle and me, where Jake looked like a man suddenly drowning in his own living room, I knew that whatever came next would be irreparable. The air didn't just feel heavy, it felt dangerous, like we were all suspended on a thin sheet of glass that was already starting to crack beneath the weight of too many buried truths finally clawing their way to the surface. My mother was the first to move. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the hardwood, her napkin falling to the floor like a white flag, though I knew there'd be no surrender. She looked straight at me, her eyes no longer warm or performatively maternal, but tight, controlled, and simmering with the kind of fury only a parent capable of self-deception can summon. "Emily," she said, voice sharp but quiet, like a knife wrapped in velvet, "you planned this, didn't you? You and Danielle. You knew, and you timed this, and you decided that tonight of all nights, was the right time to humiliate your brother in front of our family." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her, and for a moment, I tried to understand how someone could be so willfully blind, so determined to preserve the illusion of a perfect son that she'd rather believe I orchestrated a revenge plot than accept the fact that Jake's downfall had been authored by no one but himself. And then, slowly, I tilted my head and said, not with malice, but with the kind of blunt clarity I had long denied myself, "No, Mom. I didn't plan it. But I'm not sorry it happened." That seemed to unhinge something in her, some internal hinge she'd been desperately holding together. She stepped closer, dropped her voice to a whisper, but one that buzzed with venom. "You've always been jealous of him. That's what this is about, isn't it? He gets the love, and you get the degrees and the titles, and that's never been enough for you. There it was, the confession she'd never say out loud, dressed up as an accusation. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity had finally crystallized into something I could no longer pretend didn't exist. I leaned in slightly, close enough that she could see how little it hurt anymore. "You gave him everything, and he still managed to destroy it," I said. "I took what I was given and made something out of it, and you resented me for not needing you to do it." I saw the slap before it happened. It didn't come, not physically, but her eyes twitched, and I knew that if we were alone, if this weren't a room full of half-shocked guests still clutching their wine glasses and unsure whether to stay or pretend they had a babysitter emergency, she might have actually raised her hand. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked away, not toward Jake, but toward the kitchen, like she could clean this mess up with a rag and some dish soap. Meanwhile, Jake was still standing there, the echo of Danielle's words and mine still rippling through the air around him. He looked smaller now, somehow, like the truth had shrunk him. His charm, his confidence, the weightless arrogance he'd always carried like a tailored suit, it had all been peeled away, and underneath was something uncertain and soft, something that didn't know how to survive without applause. He looked at me, and for the first time in years, I didn't see a brother, I saw a man who had never been told no, who had never been made to sit in the uncomfortable quiet that follows exposure. "You don't know what it's like," he muttered, almost to himself, though his voice carried across the room. "You've always had everything figured out. Everyone always thought you were perfect." And that, more than anything, made me want to laugh again, because the notion that I had somehow breezed through life while he scraped by was the most grotesque rewriting of our family history I could imagine. I stepped closer, not to intimidate, but because I needed him to hear me clearly. "No, Jake," I said slowly, "I just never expected anyone else to clean up after me." Danielle had vanished somewhere during the fallout, and I couldn't blame her. The weight of truth is exhausting, and dropping it in front of people who refuse to carry it with you is even more so. I found her sitting outside on the porch swing, her dress bunched up awkwardly beneath her, shoes off, hair a little undone. She didn't look triumphant. She looked relieved and bone-tired. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, sitting next to her, the wood creaking beneath us. "Don't be," she replied without looking at me. "I've been holding this in for months. And I didn't want to ruin anyone's night. I couldn't live another day pretending to love someone who lies for sport." We sat there for a while, listening to the muffled sounds of a party that had quickly turned into whispered exits and awkward glances. Eventually, I reached into my bag and pulled out the flash drive I'd been holding onto, not out of planning, but instinct. It held more than just work presentations and spreadsheets. It held screenshots, messages, things Lori had sent me months ago when she found out about Danielle and didn't know what to do. I hadn't meant to bring it, but somehow I had. I handed it to Danielle, who looked at me with surprise. "What's this?" "Just in case he tries to spin a different version of tonight," I said. "There's more than just Lori. And you're not the only one he tried to fool." She didn't take it right away. Then slowly, with a soft exhale, she did. It wasn't vengeance. Not really. It was something else, something closer to mercy. Mercy for every woman who'd been told to smile and stay quiet, for every daughter who got asked to shrink herself so someone else could take up more room, for every person who learned to carry their own truth because no one would carry it with them. Inside the house, the party was over. But out here, in the quiet, something else had started. Something that looked a little like freedom and a lot like justice. The first time I realized my mother loved Jake in a different way, more indulgently, more blindly, with a kind of fierce, protective favoritism that bordered on irrational, I was 8 years old and sitting at the top of the staircase, knees pulled to my chest, listening to her tell my father that boys just mature slower and Emily doesn't need as much attention because she's always fine. That night, Jake had thrown a tantrum in the middle of a church gathering, kicking over a fruit tray because it didn't have the gummy bears he liked, and I had stood quietly next to him, cheeks burning with embarrassment, trying to pretend I didn't know him. And yet, somehow, when we got home, it wasn't Jake who was scolded or sent to his room, it was me who was told I should have stepped in and helped him manage his feelings, as if I were his second mother and not a little girl barely old enough to spell. responsibility, let alone carry it. That moment, that logic, became the blueprint for everything that followed. Every mistake Jake made was met with excuses, with gentle reframes, with deflection. If he lied, it was because he was under pressure. If he failed, it was because the system isn't built for boys like him. If he hurt someone, and he did, many times it was always someone else's fault, or worse, a misunderstanding. My successes were expected, taken for granted, rarely celebrated unless they served to reflect well on the family. Straight A's? Of course, she got them. She's our little overachiever. College scholarship? Well, thank God, one of our kids is taking school seriously. Promotion after promotion? Emily's always been responsible, said with the same enthusiasm you'd reserve for someone who remembers to floss. That resentment, quiet and poisonous, had been simmering for decades by the time I walked back into the house from the porch and found my mother standing in the dining room, alone, rearranging the flower arrangements with a kind of manic intensity, as if repositioning a few peonies could somehow rewind the evening and undo the unraveling of the family mythology she'd clung to for so long. I didn't want a confrontation, at least, not at first, but something about the way she refused to even acknowledge what had happened, the way she went straight into damage control mode without a single moment of reflection or accountability, flipped a switch in me I didn't know still had power after all these years. "You're not even going to ask if it's true?" I said, my voice calm but firm, like I was asking her to verify a weather report and not whether her son had been cheating on his fiancée and lying to her face. She didn't look up. "There's a time and a place, Emily. And this wasn't it. I can't believe you stood there and made a speech. That was cruel." It was as if the truth itself was irrelevant. The only real crime was that it had been spoken out loud. "He did it," I said plainly. "You don't even have to believe me. Talk to Lori. Talk to Danielle. Talk to anyone who's seen the messages." She finally looked at me then, and the expression on her face wasn't confusion or denial or even grief, it was anger. Controlled, matriarchal, disapproving anger. "You think you're better than him," she said, not quite shouting but loud enough that I knew she wanted me to hear it as clearly as possible. "You always have. You think because you have some big job and no husband and no kids that you get to look down on him." That hurt, but not because it was true, because it was so clearly her own projection, so clearly rooted in her refusal to see me as someone independent from the role she had written for me in her head, the reliable daughter, the backup adult, the one who never needed anything from anyone, especially not her. I stepped closer, not to intimidate, but to make sure she saw how serious I was. "No," I said, "I don't think I'm better than him. I think I'm just not allowed to mess up in this family without consequences. I think if I had done even half of what Jake's done, you would have disowned me. And you know it." She didn't respond, not with words. But her face faltered, just for a second. A brief flicker of recognition, of guilt maybe, before she turned away and began collecting used napkins from the table as if our conversation were nothing more than background noise. That was when I realized she wouldn't admit it. Not now. Maybe not ever. The version of Jake she had built in her mind was the one she needed to believe in to justify all the ways she had overlooked him. To face the truth now would be to admit that she'd been wrong about both of us all along, and I don't think her ego could survive that. I left her there, rearranging her reality one centerpiece at a time, and went to find Danielle. She was still outside, phone in hand now, talking quietly to someone. I assumed it was a friend, or maybe Lori, maybe both. When she saw me, she ended the call and pocketed her phone. "You all right?" I asked. She nodded, then paused. "I thought I'd feel lighter, you know? But I don't. I feel guilty." That word stung, not because it was wrong, but because it was so familiar. Guilt was the default setting in our family, guilt for speaking out, guilt for standing up, guilt for not being who they wanted you to be. "He made this mess," I said. "You didn't. You just stopped pretending it wasn't real." Danielle looked at me for a long time, and then, quietly, she said, "He told me once that you were jealous of him, that you hated how close he was with your mom." I laughed, not bitterly, not cruelly, just with the kind of exhausted amusement that comes when someone confirms something you always suspected but never quite dared to say out loud. She made me jealous, I said. He just enjoyed it. Danielle didn't say anything after that. She just handed me back the flash drive I'd given her earlier. I made a copy, she said. But I think you should keep this. He's going to spin this, Emily. He's going to call you bitter and vindictive, and your mother will believe every word. I took it, nodded slowly. Then we'll let the facts speak for themselves. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was something. A small, solid piece of truth I could hold in my hand, evidence that the story was finally shifting in a direction that didn't erase me in favor of someone who'd always assumed he'd be protected. And if my mother couldn't face it, and Jake refused to own it, then maybe, just maybe, it was time I stopped caring what they thought altogether. Because in the end, the hardest part of growing up isn't realizing your parents are flawed, it's realizing they're not going to change, and deciding to tell the truth anyway. By the time the last car had pulled out of the driveway and the porch lights were dimmed to their faintest setting, the house felt less like a home and more like a battlefield after the smoke has cleared. The furniture still standing, but the silence screaming with everything that had been said and everything that couldn't be unsaid. The laughter, forced and brittle, that had filled the air earlier in the evening had long since faded into a vacuum of discomfort. And the lingering scent of vanilla candles and slightly burnt appetizers hung in the air like an uninvited guest no one dared acknowledge. I sat at the kitchen island, heels off, hair coming loose, still holding a half-empty wine glass that had gone warm, not because I wanted to drink, but because setting it down felt like acknowledging the evening had truly ended, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Not because I wished to relive it, but because I knew the consequences hadn't even started to reveal themselves. My father, quiet and deliberate as ever, emerged from the den and joined me without ceremony. He didn't ask questions, didn't pretend to smile, and didn't offer comfort in the traditional sense. He simply slid a coaster across the counter toward me, a small, subtle gesture that carried the weight of decades of shared silence between us. We had never talked much, not beyond pleasantries or family logistics, but there was something about the way he sat beside me that night that made me feel like, for the first time, he wasn't going to pretend things were fine. He took a deep breath, his hand resting on the counter, fingers lightly tapping, as if warming up for words he hadn't yet decided to say. "You were right to say it," he finally murmured, his voice low but steady, not breaking the stillness, but rather adding a note of calm to it. I turned to look at him, surprised not by the sentiment, but by the fact that he said it aloud, without preface or qualification. "Did you know?" I asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity, because if anyone had the ability to observe without intervening, it was my father, always present, always watching, but never quite stepping into the conflict. He nodded slowly. I suspected. I saw the way he talked to her, the way he avoided looking her in the eye when she asked him direct questions. And I saw how you looked at him, like you were waiting for someone else to see what you've seen all your life. There it was. Not validation, not absolution, but a kind of quiet recognition I hadn't realized I needed. He didn't try to defend Jake, didn't make excuses, didn't minimize the chaos or pretend we'd all laugh about this someday over Thanksgiving dinner. He just sat there, shoulders slumped slightly forward, hands folded now, as if exhausted by the weight of years spent pretending one child wasn't being sacrificed at the altar of another's mediocrity. The next day, Jake showed up. He didn't call first, didn't text, just arrived like a storm no one bothered to predict, unannounced, unwanted, but impossible to ignore. I saw him through the window, pacing near the front steps, phone in hand, muttering to himself before finally walking up and ringing the bell like he hadn't spent the entire night before unraveling in front of 36 people. I opened the door and stood there, letting the screen separate us, not out of malice, but because I wanted him to feel, if only for a second, what it was like to be on the outside of something you always assumed would include you by default. "You got what you wanted," he said without greeting, his voice somewhere between defiance and desperation, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. "You stood up in front of everyone, made your little speech, and made sure they all saw me like you always wanted them to. You happy now?" I studied him for a moment, taking in the posture of a man who was used to being rescued, but suddenly found himself without a life raft. You think this was about me wanting to humiliate you? I asked, keeping my tone level, not because I wasn't angry, but because I'd learned that true power comes not from yelling, but from speaking plainly and without apology. He laughed, short and bitter. Come on, Emily. You've always hated me. Ever since we were kids. You've been waiting for a moment like this. And maybe there was a time when that would have been true. When I would have fantasized about watching him fall from grace, about seeing that smug smile wiped clean off his face. But now? Now it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like exposure. Like the light had finally been turned on in a room I'd spent decades being told to keep dark. I didn't make you lie to Danielle, I said, arms crossed loosely over my chest. I didn't tell you to sleep with Lori. And I sure as hell didn't ask you to spend your life pretending you were someone you're not. You did that. I just stopped covering for you. He looked at me then, really looked, and in that moment, I saw something new, something raw and deeply unfamiliar. Not guilt, not remorse, but fear. Not fear of me, or even of consequence, but fear of a future where the family mythology that had protected him his entire life had finally shattered beyond repair. I'm going to fix this, he said quietly, more to himself than to me. I'll talk to Danielle. I'll explain. She's not interested in explanations, I replied. She's interested in the truth. And she already has it. He didn't respond. Just stood there, shoulders hunched, defeated not by one moment, but by 1,000 decisions that had finally caught up with him. Eventually, he turned and walked away, not with the arrogance he used to carry, but with the hesitancy of someone who doesn't know who he is when no one else is clapping. A week later, I got a message. It wasn't from Jake or Danielle, but from Lori, the woman whose name had turned that party upside down. She thanked me for the flash drive, for giving Danielle the tools to walk away without looking back, and then she added something else. She mentioned that Jake had borrowed money from her, lied about needing it for rent after a job fell through, and then vanished without paying it back. She'd been too embarrassed to tell anyone until now. I didn't hesitate. I replied immediately. And by the end of the day, we had a meeting scheduled at a law firm. When I arrived, Danielle was already there, seated in the lobby with a cup of coffee and an expression that no longer looked like heartbreak, but resolve. Lori joined us moments later, and we exchanged the kind of nod that passes between women who've learned to stop apologizing for their clarity. We didn't meet to destroy him. We met to end the story he had written about all of us. The one where he was the hero, and we were just supporting characters, easily discarded or rewritten. We weren't angry, not anymore. We were precise, determined, unafraid. And as I sat there, waiting for the lawyer to call us in, I thought about my mother, still clinging to the version of her son she needed to believe in, and I wondered what stories she'd have to invent now to make sense of the silence he'd leave behind. People say revenge is petty. They say it leaves you empty, that it makes you just as bad as the person who wronged you. But those people rarely talk about the revenge that looks like truth, that sounds like women speaking plainly, without shame, without fear, without waiting for permission. And sometimes, that kind of revenge isn't about rage, it's about release. And maybe I should have kept quiet, like my mother begged me to. Maybe I should have swallowed the truth one more time for the sake of appearances. But I didn't. I looked the lie in the face and I spoke. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the quiet one anymore.